Hello, this will be the review of Joshua chapter 5 for our Sunday school lesson. So in chapter 3 and 4, the Hebrews and led by Joshua, has crossed the Jordan River. They did that at flood stage. More on that in just a minute. And they did it just a few days before the Passover that the Hebrews were basically commanded to keep. And so, even through their wilderness wanderings, they kept the Passover. And so, we see in chapter 4, verse 19, that they crossed on the 10th day of the first month, and then Passover being the 14th day of the first month. So, they crossed just a few days before Passover. And that leads me to an observation. The Hebrews crossing when they did made absolutely no sense. Now, obviously, they did it by God's leading, but by man's thinking, crossing the Jordan when they did made no sense. They crossed at flood stage instead of waiting for the spring rains to dry up and for the river to recede. They crossed when it was 2 miles wide because it had been flooded. They crossed just opposite of Jericho, the first city on the west side of the Jordan, and the first city that they attack in chapter 6. They also, as we'll see in chapter 5, after they cross, they circumcise all of the males. They had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and during that 40 years, all the males that had been born during that time had not been circumcised. And in chapter 5 deals mainly with the circumcision of these men. And so we see here this act in chapter 5, this act of circumcising all the men causes them to basically be incapacitated for a time, perhaps a week. And so they've crossed the Jordan. They are within sight of the city of Jericho, and they circumcise all their men so that they can't fight if they were to be attacked. They also observe the Passover on the west side of the Jordan River. And then I also have, well, I guess that was it. The items that just don't make sense as far as man's thinking goes. It would have been simpler for them to have waited. They had been on the east side of the Jordan River for about a year anyway. So what difference would have made to have crossed in a couple months after Passover and go ahead and circumcise all the men before you cross over? And so none of the events that we read about and that we're going to talk about really make sense as far as man's thinking goes. But God and His timing, God and His planning, God and His all-knowing ordains that this is the way it's to be. And so in chapter 5, we see that they've crossed, and then Joshua is given the commandment to circumcise all the males because they had not been circumcised in the 40 years in the wilderness. So they do that, and it says there that in verse 5 that they were all circumcised, and it says there in verse 8 that they abode in their place, or in other words, they camped out in the same spot. They didn't move until all the men were whole. I'm not for sure how long that would take. I'm guessing a week. But nevertheless, they were incapacitated and could not fight until the men were whole. Then we see that they observed the Passover in verse 10. And then it says in verse 11 that after the Passover, God dried up the manna. And so God was not going to supply them with the manna that He had been supplying for them daily for the past 40 years. So they were going to be eating the fruit of the land and the fruit of Canaan. Canaan was a land flowing with milk and honey. It's been described that way many times in Scripture. And so once they have settled in Canaan, or they've crossed into Canaan, the manna that God had been giving them daily goes away. Toward the end of chapter 5, we see Joshua meeting what is considered to be a man with a sword. This man ends up actually being Jesus Christ. We see here in verse 13 of chapter 5, Joshua goes to this man, Jesus, and asks, "Are you for us, or are you for our adversaries?" In verse 14, Jesus tells him that I am the captain of the host of the Lord, and I am now come. And Jesus commands Joshua in verse 15 to remove his shoes because he is standing on holy ground. So in a similar fashion, the way Moses was confronted by the Lord in the burning bush in Exodus chapter 2 or 3, we see here, and was told to remove his feet, or his shoes from his feet. We see here in Joshua chapter 5 verse 15, Joshua going through the same type of initiation, perhaps. That might not be the right word, but the same ritual as Moses did some 40 years prior, in the removing of his feet at the burning bush, because that ground was considered to be holy or sacred as well. So a lot goes on in chapter 5 as a review. Again, basically dealing with the circumcision of the men, but just thinking about all these other things that happen that really, again, in the man's way of thinking doesn't make sense. But God and his providence and God showing his might and his power brings the Hebrews across the Jordan River when it just absolutely made no sense to any men. Obviously, the forces of Jericho seeing this, as we'll see later, that their hearts melted because of all these people coming and not knowing how to defend against them. So that's the review for Joshua chapter 5. It's a short chapter, 15 verses, so it doesn't take long to read through that. But just consider these things as you read through. Thank you for watching.